Hello and welcome to Shark Freaks, the world's #1 shark podcast. Did you know that? Out of all of the shark podcasts in the world, the most people listen to our shark podcast.
How many shark podcasts do you think there are in reality?
In reality, outside of the bit, 3? I don't know. Are there shark podcasts?
Probably too many. I mean,
Yeah.
how many conversations can you have about sharks?
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, sharks are cool, but how can you talk about sharks?
What if Shark Week was every week?
It can be with the right state of mind.
Just listen. If you're, what, Kelly Slater or what? Is that her name?
The surfer who got her arm bitten off by the shark?
Yeah.
I think so. I don't know.
Shark Week's probably every week for her.
Shark Week is every day. Well, yeah, so this is Shark Freaks. I'm your host, Matisse Van Rossum, and I'm joined by Ben Sheets.
Hello.
And, yeah, it is Shark Week here on Shark Freaks. And in honor of Shark Week, we are going to be devoting the majority of this episode to a discussion of the greatest shark movie of all time, the auteurist classic. You probably know which movie I'm talking about. That's right. We're talking about Shark Boy and Lava Girl. Now, Ben, the thing about Shark Boy and Lava Girl is that Lava Girl is she doesn't matter, because first and foremost, she's a woman, and second of all, how can you be lava and also a girl? So that's not important. We're here to talk about Shark Boy. He's a boy, he's a shark, and what else do you need to say?
Yeah, I mean, when the movie's underwater, Lava Girl is kind of limited.
She's basically useless. And I mean, if you look at the title, it's not Lava Girl and Shark Boy. It's Shark Boy and Lava Girl. He gets first billing because he is the most important. And the cool thing about being a boy who is also a shark is by day he skateboards around the halls of his high school with his fellow teens, chatting up babes, but then at night he uses his exceptionally powerful bite to basically just remove the limbs of anybody who bullies him. You can't bully Shark Boy.
Well, my favorite scene of that movie is when Shark Boy uses his shark gills to blow an endless giant vape cloud.
Oh yeah, well I mean,
teens do these days.
Shark Boy definitely vapes, and the thing is that most people don't know is that Shark Boy is actually the one who started the vaping craze, because that movie came out in like the mid 2000s, and people weren't really vaping that much back then, and then they saw Shark Boy and they saw those fat, delicious clouds coming out of his gills, and they were like, yes, that's what I need to be doing.
Sign me up.
Sign me up. And, so we can really thank Shark Boy, not only for vape trick YouTube channels, which are, of course, my favorite YouTube channels, and probably yours as well, but also nobody's going to have cancer now because nobody's smoking cigarettes. Everybody's vaping like Shark Boy.
That's just science.
Thank you for listening to Shark Freaks. We'll catch you next time. In all seriousness, we are going to be talking about Jaws today, which is, I think, the greatest shark movie of all time.
Besides Shark Boy and Lava Girl.
Besides Shark Boy and Lava Girl.
Yeah, Jaws, directed by Steven Spielberg.
1975, very early in Spielberg's career. Pretty much kickstarted his career.
Yeah.
He did one other feature before Jaws,
Duel.
right? Duel, that's right.
Which is an episode in its own respect.
I've never seen Duel.
Oh, it's awesome. But we'll talk about that later. Yeah, Jaws really not only kickstarted Steven Spielberg's career, but also kickstarted the event blockbuster, the tentpole blockbuster movie.
It was truly the first summer blockbuster. By blockbuster, we of course mean like a film that comes out in the peak season when kids are out of school, people are going to see movies, and a movie that you go to see time and time again because it's so great and whatnot. And like after the success of Jaws, everybody was trying to make the next summer blockbuster.
Yes, especially right after Jaws, you saw a slew of, knockoff Jaws movies. Orca the Killer Whale, Alligator, Piranha, which, technically is a parody of Jaws, but you got plenty of these creature features that came after it.
And this was the movie that really made people pay attention to Steven Spielberg, and he followed it up 2 years later with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and then not long after that, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and that was really like the start of his super hot streak. And I mean, honestly, like, Spielberg's a great director. He has made some not good movies.
Are you telling me that War Horse isn't a masterpiece?
Well, no, that's
Are
obviously
you telling me
his best
that
movie.
Ready Player One isn't top-tier filmmaking?
Don't forget about War of the Worlds starring Tom Cruise.
Oh, yeah. Masterpiece.
Definitely can't forget about that one. And we also can't forget about Bridge of Spies, the excellent movie that everybody immediately forgot about, myself included. And
Steven Spielberg nowadays is kind of a mixed bag. I can't remember the last great Spielberg movie.
Well, I'll say I can't remember the last Spielberg movie that left a lasting impression on me. I did actually enjoy Bridge of Spies when I saw it, but like I said, I immediately forgot about it. Like, I was looking back at my Letterboxd page not long ago, and I saw that I had put Bridge of Spies as one of my top films of 2015, and if you ask me now what happened in that movie, I could only give you the broadest plot strokes.
You got spies, and
there's a bridge, and
they're under the bridge, and they're doing the spy stuff in enemy lines. And
all I remember about Bridge of Spies is that Tom Hanks has a cold the entire movie, and he won't shut up about it. He's in Russia, and all he keeps saying is, "I have a cold, and I want to go home." And that's
do you
the film.
think Steven Spielberg, heard that it was the Cold War and really misconstrued it?
Oh, that's some galaxy brain shit. I never even considered the possibility, but it makes sense. It's the Cold War, and Tom Hanks has a cold. I almost said Tom Cruise. Honestly, I think Tom Cruise would have been better in that movie. He runs way better than Tom Hanks.
Yes.
Jaws stars the powerhouse trio of Roy Scheider, Richard Dreyfuss, and Robert Shaw. Only one of whom is still alive. Rest in peace, Roy Scheider and Robert Shaw. I was surprised that this movie got a PG rating when it came out. We were talking about that when we were watching it. I mean, I know this was before the creation of the PG-13 rating, and it was one of the films that kind of got the MPAA to be like, oh, maybe we should have a middle ground between PG and R. I mean,
I don't think this movie is that gruesome. I think it's a movie that you could honestly take your whole family to. There's a couple of scary scenes.
I mean, it's pretty bloody at times. Like, if it came out today, I think it would definitely get an R rating. But I mean, times has changed. Also, like, fucking MPAA ratings are completely arbitrary.
Yeah. And I mean, like, considering it would be a blockbuster summer movie, it could probably get away with a PG-13 rating as is.
I think the MPAA would cut a lot of the blood and gore from it. I mean, it's not particularly graphic, but it does have some bloody scenes and see a couple of dismembered corpses. And that's kind of the thing that the children can't see. You got to protect the tender eyes of the children.
Yeah. I could see it being PG-13 if it was released today, considering there is now a PG-13 rating.
Yeah, true. But in a lot of PG-13 action movies, they specifically do not have blood.
Well, sometimes, not always. But I was surprised that it was PG, but at the same time, it didn't shock me that much. In the 70s, they were much more lax about what got a PG rating.
For sure. And large chunks of this movie are pretty family friendly.
Yeah.
It gets much more adult towards the end. I know I saw it as a small child, and some of the stuff in the later half of the movie definitely left an impression on me as a young boy.
One of the biggest things that would have gotten it an R rating is that you see titties in the first minute.
2 minutes. Yeah.
So the movie starts with this opening kill scene where it's like drunk college kids.
I think they're supposed to be high schoolers because in the autopsy scene they say the girl that gets killed was 15.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that makes the titties a little weird.
It makes the titties very weird. I might have misheard that, but I think I caught that last night, and even though I've seen this movie a million times.
Notice that.
Yeah, so that's a little weird. But yeah, we've got this great opening kill scene of these drunk teenagers partying on the beach, and two of them go off to swim. And the girl is out in the water, and she starts getting dragged around, screaming bloody murder by something in the water, and pulled under. And that's the last we see of her. And I think that as a setup kill for a movie is pretty effective, not only in the subtlety of it, but also that actress's performance. Like, she makes it seem like she's actually being eaten by a shark.
Yeah, she does a really good job. The scene is elevated too by the first time we hear the fantastic score from John Williams.
The iconic Jaws theme, which Spielberg originally thought was ridiculous. The first time he went to John Williams was like, okay, what do you have for me? And John Williams played him a recording. Spielberg thought it was a joke. He laughed and he was like, okay, but like, what do you really have for me? And John Williams was like, no, like, that's it. And I mean, the rest is history, as they say. It's one of the most iconic film themes of all time. I don't think there's a person alive today who hears that and doesn't know exactly what it is.
I mean, all you have to hear is two notes and...
Yeah. I mean, say what you want about simplicity versus complexity, but when you got an earworm, you got an earworm.
Exactly.
If it's a hook, if it sticks with you, then...
it slaps,
if it slaps. And like the national anthem doesn't even slap.
No.
But
we should replace the national anthem with the Jaws theme. Everyone's standing with their hands against their hearts.
Bonham. Can somebody make that like a video of a football game or something, but replace the national anthem with the Jaws theme? Oh my god. So after that, we're introduced to one of our main characters, Martin Brody, played by the amazing Roy Scheider, who is the new police chief of Amity Island, a summer resort town that basically receives its entire annual income from tourists coming to the beach.
Yeah, in the summer. So obviously having a shark attack is not good for the town economy.
Right. Well, that's one of the best things about the first act that I think we definitely agree on is this struggle between Chief Brody and the mayor, played by Murray Hamilton. Obviously, Brody wants to close the beaches because there's a shark, like multiple people have been killed. And the mayor is like, fuck no, this is our town's livelihood. We're gonna be bankrupt if, we don't get that income from our summer tourists. So make the beaches safe, but we're not closing the beach. And that leads to an even higher body count, more people being killed by the shark because they refuse to close the beach.
Yeah, and I think like having that juxtaposition of money and livelihoods versus safety is a really cool thematic idea.
I agree, because, like, the shark is the villain of this movie, but it could be argued that the real villain is Murray Hamilton. Because a shark is a shark, The shark's doing what a shark is going to do. And Murray Hamilton is not only an asshole and an incredible asshole, but is not willing to close the beaches even at the cost of people dying.
Well, first off, Murray Hamilton is like one of the all-time movie heels.
Oh, yeah.
But I think it works really well as, kind of a subplot to keep the first act lively and keep the stakes high. Because if, they were acting just regardless of money, they would just close the beaches right away.
Right.
And then it's like, what do you do with the rest of the movie?
It gives a very realistic reason to have this sort of bureaucratic power struggle and to incite Chief Brody becoming so frustrated with this that he gets more and more tense throughout the movie to the point where, they finally have to hire Robert Shaw to hunt down and kill the beast.
Well, that's the thing, because he feels guilty in
Right.
a lot of ways for not closing the beach, because while it is his call, he does have to report to the mayor.
Right, but as the chief of police, the residents of Amity Island's safety is like on him. It's literally his job to keep the people safe, and he can't really do that. Compounding on that he's a transfer from New York City. He comes out to Amity to be the chief to get away from the horrible crime and stuff in the city, but now he's faced with a totally different and arguably worse threat that he's much less equipped to deal with.
And I love that character motivation. I think, honestly, all three of the main characters have really good, interesting, complex motivations.
I agree, and that's something that is sort of what I would consider a hallmark of 70s horror. A lot of the time, the real action, the real scares, don't happen until, like, over halfway through the film. 70s horror is much more of a slow burn, and it takes its time setting up your characters, letting you really get to know them, their little quirks and nuances, to the point that when the threat is truly present, that you actually care if they live or die, or if they succeed or fail.
Yeah, and they do that really well. They do a great job of setting up the characters, but at the same time, I think the first act of this movie is incredibly paced, because while they're setting up characters, they keep it point to point to point, keep the action coming along with multiple shark attacks happening, finding remains of shark attacks that have happened.
But all without seeing the shark up till this point, which is crucial, I think. And I mean, it was necessity of the actual animatronic shark being a piece of shit and constantly breaking down.
Yeah, they named it something, right?
They named it Bruce after Steven Spielberg's lawyer. And the shark from Finding Nemo, Bruce, is named after that. But they also called it the Great White Turd. So they were sort of forced to keep it subtle, to keep the shark hidden. You only see the aftermath, or somebody being dragged around in the water, or like a spurt of blood or something. And it really leaves a lot up to your imagination, because you don't know how big this shark is. You know it's big, but then by the time it's finally revealed over halfway through the movie, it's like, holy fuck, that's a really big shark.
Well, and I love it too because the scale of the shark is an unknown for the characters too. You know, they know that it's a great white, but they don't know like how big of a great white.
Well, they
it
don't.
is.
They don't even know that it's a great white until after they bring in Richard Dreyfuss, and he finds the tooth in the sunken boat, which is also a good way through the movie. You know, they bring in this oceanographic researcher to sort of like help them figure out what's going on, and they put a bounty on the shark, and some local fishermen catch a very big shark. But, Richard Dreyfuss keeps telling them, like, this is not the shark that killed those people. Like, the bite radius is too small. Let's cut this thing open and see what's in its digestive system. And, Murray Hamilton is just like, it doesn't matter if they got the shark. They got a shark. People are going to feel better. They're going to think that they got the shark.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also Murray Hamilton makes a really good point when he's like, I don't want to cut open the shark and have a bunch of kid remains fall out everywhere.
Right. Which is why they end up doing the autopsy late at night in secret.
While hammered.
While drunk. And then immediately decide to go out on a boat to try to find the real shark, which I love, because Brody's just like, I'm not drunk enough to go out on a boat and look for this shark. And Richard Dreyfuss just like, yes, you are. We're going. This is one of Richard Dreyfuss's first roles, too. Like, he was really young in this, and he's fantastic.
Yeah, he does a great job in this movie.
Everybody in this movie is so good. Like, Roy Scheider already had a pretty well-established career. They got him for this movie because of his performance in The French Connection, which came out a couple of years before this. Mm-hmm. But yeah, like, Richard Dreyfuss was relatively unknown, and I think you could definitely say that he owes a lot of his career success to this movie, because it really kind of made him explode onto the scene. And he's got great chemistry with Roy Scheider, too. Like, the three main characters have really good, interesting chemistry, which is what makes them such likable characters and what makes their scenes together so good.
Yeah, I think they all do a really incredible job. They all do really good drunks, too.
Well, Robert Shaw was not acting like a drunk.
That's just him.
He just was. He just was a drunk.
Well, Robert Shaw in this movie is also incredible, though. His intro monologue when he's first introduced, we're at kind of a meeting of the town to decide whether they're going to close the beach or not. They're talking about putting a bounty on the shark, and Robert Shaw introduces himself by scratching a chalkboard with his fingernail.
Yeah, it's great. Everybody's just yelling and arguing over each other, and you can't hear anything, and then he's just like scratching nails on a chalkboard, which is such a good way to get people's attention. It's such an unpleasant sound, and it says so much about his character right off the bat too, before we even know him, that he's not the type of guy to bother trying to shout over everybody. He's just gonna get people's attention by whatever means necessary. This sort of sardonic, wry character that he is. And it's great. And having that monologue and being like, I'm like, I'll find this shark for you, but 3,000 ain't gonna cut it. Like, you're gonna pay me 10,000 and I'll get you the shark. And he's kind of this Captain Ahab character, which is really great. I know that the way they originally wanted to introduce him was having him in a theater watching the old Gregory Peck Moby Dick from the 50s. And they weren't able to do that because Gregory Peck wouldn't give them the rights because he owned part of the rights. So they found a new way to introduce him, and I think it's much better.
Yeah, I think that would have been way too on the nose because it definitely is Captain Ahab as a character in this movie. Like, it's pretty much taken exactly from Moby Dick.
Like you get that impression just from how he is and the way he behaves and how he talks. And I think to introduce him by having him watch Moby Dick would have been like, hey, get it? This is our Ahab character. And it would have been way too on the nose. I agree completely.
I think they do a good job of subtly introducing him as that character without really hitting it too hard on the nose.
Well, the thing about it, too, is after that initial scene where he's introduced, he sort of disappears for a little while because obviously Murray Hamilton doesn't want to pay him 3 times the bounty that they're offering when he thinks that just anybody can go out and get this shark. So it's like, we know when he's introduced, it's like, okay, this is gonna be the guy who goes out to catch the shark, but they don't just jump to that right away. They have to have the stakes escalate even higher with the deaths of or the death of yet another person on the 4th of July, on their biggest day of the year, when the shark comes into like the lagoon where they think it's safe. And that's the first time we sort of see the shark. We see it underwater as it's coming up on the dude that it's just knocked out of his boat. But like at that point in the movie, just like the glimpse you get of it is just enough. Like, you can see like, holy shit, this is a big fucking scary shark, but then they pull right back.
It's so brief that it leaves so much up to the imagination.
Yeah, it's still so largely obscured. And then finally, after this last death, they agree. It's like, okay, we'll hire Quint and he'll kill the shark, but under the condition that Roy Scheider and Richard Dreyfuss join him on his boat.
Yeah. Well, I think, not seeing the shark is so important because it leaves so much up to the imagination, and paired with the John Williams score and some really great underwater photography.
Yeah, that's a big thing about this movie.
It feels so much more imposing than it would if you just saw the shark the whole time. They do a great job of having shots where they're like floating almost between underwater and above water sometimes.
Yeah, to give the perspective of like a swimmer or something, like sort of dipping above and below the water.
Yeah, and they do a great job with the sound design of underwater. Very reverby, echoey kind of underwater sounds that feel real.
What works so well too is the decision to shoot in and on the actual ocean and not in a tank like in a studio, which was the norm at that time because it's more easily controllable environment. But they were like, no, we want to make it seem real. We're going to shoot on the water. And it pays off, definitely, because most of it had to be shot handheld to compensate for shooting on a boat and the motion of the ocean, as they say.
They do a lot of other really cool cinematography things in this movie. This movie kind of made a signature style of the dolly zoom,
Yeah.
where when Roy Schneider, Roy Scheider, he realizes that there's a shark in the lagoon.
Or when it's when the little boy is killed before the 4th of July. When they're on the beach, and we get that the vertigo shot where you physically move the camera forward while zooming out so it expands the depth of field, and it's like one of the most famous shots in cinema history. And yeah, it's super memorable. Like, everybody knows that shot. It's like maybe the one shot from Jaws that everybody remembers above all else. What I also really like in terms of like the cinematography and the way they shoot stuff is Steven Spielberg is really good at visual storytelling, like showing you details that tell you something about what's happening without it being explicitly stated or anything like that. Stuff like later on the boat when they have the shark like tied to the boat and it's pulling them, and Quint runs for the machete to cut the ropes, and you have the shot from inside the boat cabin and you can see the machete on the wall on the side as Quint comes from the background to the foreground to grab it. It's just like little details like that where you see the object that's important in the shot without him being like, I'm gonna go get the machete, or having it cut to a shot of just the machete and then like his hand coming in and grabbing it. Like, it's details like that I think do really make Steven Spielberg a great director, even despite some of his lazier films later in his life.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of his opus in a lot of ways.
I mean, yeah, he has done a lot of great films, but it's my favorite out of all of his films that I've seen.
And well, I think it's mine as well. Going on to the second act, the three of them decide that they have to, hunt the great white.
Yeah, they don't have a choice. 3 people have been killed now, and even the mayor agrees that something has to be done.
And you get a really cool chemistry between the 3 characters, as Robert Shaw has, practical years of ship knowledge, while Richard Dreyfuss has, oceanographic experience.
Yeah, you've got like this weathered, like salty sea captain who has made a career out of hunting sharks. It's what he does. And then you've got like the rich kid academic who knows scientific things about sharks. And then you've got Chief Brody, who is afraid of the water and doesn't even like being on a boat, but he's there because he's the chief of police. It's his duty to see that this is done properly. So you have this really fantastic chemistry between the 3 of them, with Robert Shaw and Richard Dreyfuss bickering, his practical knowledge versus Richard Dreyfuss's academic knowledge, and then Chief Brody trying to sort of be the middle ground and hold everything together, but he's also scared shitless and he doesn't want to be here, but it's his job. So there's so much great interaction between the 3 of them, because at this point, like, from the rest of the movie on, they are the only 3 characters in the movie.
Yeah, and the second act is probably the area where it's the least palatable for modern audiences, I would say.
I can agree with that.
The first and the third act very much feel like, a tentpole event blockbuster, whereas in the second act it slows down and lets things ruminate a little bit more. They still build tension, but they mostly expand on things like Robert Shaw's character,
right? Because he's the least developed at this point, because we've seen the least of him.
They do a lot of building up the scope of the shark.
Yes, which I agree. It's the slowest part of the film, and a lot of modern audiences have a very short attention span, and I think this is the part of the movie that people could call boring. I don't consider it boring at all, but it's definitely the least action heavy. But I think you bring up a good point about sort of this being the time where they build on the threat of the shark and the idea that maybe these guys are a little bit in over their head. Because Robert Shaw's character is very cocky. This is what he's done, for years. He's a fisherman, specifically hunting sharks. He has not yet met a shark that he couldn't take down. But we start to see that some of his tried and true tactics to hunt the shark are not enough in this case. And we see him start to get more and more frustrated and have the Ahab come out where it becomes personal for him. To him, Roy Scheider and Richard Dreyfuss are in the way. He doesn't want them there. It becomes this sort of like seeing red rage against this shark. Like, the shark is not going down how he wants it to. And so he becomes more and more irrational, which ultimately leads to his downfall.
I do really like that progression of the character. My only minor gripe about this movie, in general, actually, I think, because basically it's pretty much flawless besides that, but I think they spend a little too much time trying to emphasize the scale of the shark, because, the rest of the movie up till then, they mostly do that through your imagination. And by emphasizing that much, even while they still, show the shark very little, if any, spending so much of that time emphasizing that feels a little redundant.
I don't know if I necessarily agree. I think that it's a pretty good escalation of the shit that they're really in. At this point, we see the shark fully for the first time in the famous shot with Roy Scheider chumming the water, and he's not looking at what he's doing, and the shark comes up out of the water right next to the boat. And that's when we get the famous improvised line, "You're gonna need a bigger boat," which is really, it's amazing that line was improvised, because it really tells you exactly what you need to know. Like, this shark is way fucking bigger and way fucking meaner than anything they've seen before, and they are gonna need a bigger boat, but they don't have one.
Yeah.
And I like the barrels thing, like attaching the barrels to the shark. You could argue that it gets a little bit repetitive, but I think that really hammers home what a threat the shark is, because Quint has never had to attach more than one barrel to a shark to keep it close to the surface. But this shark takes 3 barrels and it can still pull them all underwater. And that's at the point where we really see Quint, maybe starting to doubt himself and starting to get really frustrated. And I think that really builds up to the climax perfectly. That makes the climax ultimately really, really satisfying, outside of just how entertaining it is to watch in and of itself. Because I think that by that point, the stakes fully.
Yeah, they do a great job setting up the stakes in that act. I wonder if part of the reason it feels slower, too, as a second act is because it's all limited to the water.
Yeah.
And the boat,
And because I up to this point, like you said, the first act of the movie is incredibly tightly paced. It's really fast. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of characters. It goes from one thing to the other. And then all of a sudden, you just have 3 guys on a boat. So it is a pretty dramatic shift from one to the next, but I still think it works. I almost consider it sort of time to breathe between the first and third acts.
Yeah, well, I agree that it's time to breathe. I just think maybe it could have been done a little quicker. And maybe that's just the modern audience in me, just wanting a little, or maybe even another set piece in the middle there. And you do get some little set pieces. You get, the shark cage, you get the barrels, you get the fantastic USS Indianapolis monologue.
Yeah, which Robert Shaw did in one take.
Yes, which is
insane.
incredible.
Yeah. No, I think you make a very fair argument. And I think that there are probably quite a few people out there who would agree with you. And especially for the modern audience, it is the slowest part. It's a part that you could argue gets tedious or repetitive or boring. For me, it works really well.
It is still incredibly shot, and there is a great directorial sense to it.
I never, watching that movie, think that part needs to be quickened, but that's just me. I appreciate how it kind of steps back and goes to a slower burn and sort of allows the tension to build, and we learn more about Quint. That USS Indianapolis monologue is amazing. And, it's a true story about the ship that carried the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima going down in the Pacific, and 700 of the crew of 1,300 being picked off by sharks. And that's also why we that's why we see that Quint sort of has this vendetta towards all sharks, because he spent a week surrounded by sharks, watching his friends and comrades be killed one by one, not knowing if he was going to be next. And it's at that point where you as the viewer are really like, okay, so this is why he is the way he is. It's iconic. It's a fantastic scene. Super well shot, all in one take. The reactions of Roy Scheider and Richard Dreyfuss are, really amazing, especially because they're just joking around and drinking and having a good time prior to that, and then all of a sudden it just gets really dark. And that tonal shift is so well done, and it sets up the third act when shit really gets crazy so well, and that action after that becomes so satisfying, with the shark sinking the boat and attacking the cage with Richard Dreyfuss in it, and he has to swim down to the bottom to escape, and then ultimately the shark hopping up on the side of the boat and eating Robert Shaw. That was a scene that impacted me very, very hard as a child.
Yeah, it is an incredibly executed scene. It's not terribly gory, but there is a lot of blood to it. And I think more than anything, Robert Shaw sells it incredibly well.
Well, yeah, I find it incredibly gruesome. Yeah, there's not much actual gore, but there is a ton of blood. And what I love so much is how the USS Indianapolis monologue foreshadows that moment so well, when he's talking about, a shark has black eyes like doll's eyes. And then until it bites you and they roll over white and you hear that high-pitched screaming. And then that's exactly what happens to Robert Shaw in, just 15 minutes later. And him selling it is so fucking good and so real. It's just viscerally very disturbing to me. It still is, even as an adult man. Granted, I grew up on the Gulf Coast where shark attacks are a thing, not super common. Like, sharks aren't the killing machines that this movie would lead you to believe, but, like, hey, it happens.
What were more common, shark attacks or gator attacks?
Gator attacks, for sure. They're more common, and you're more likely to end up in their territory, and they're super aggressive. So yeah, gators. I grew up in a place where if you go into the water anywhere that's not a bathtub or a swimming pool, you have to look out for a large prehistoric predator that might kill you. And, I'm not afraid of the water. I love swimming, but, there's always that little inkling in the back of my mind. Like, I'm always on the lookout for some water monster coming to get me.
Well, yeah, and I can understand that. I mean, growing up in the Midwest, I never really... There was always a distance when I saw Jaws, like, it was
a literal
spooky.
Distance.
Yeah, it was spooky, but, like, I don't know. I never
It's not
really
something that
experienced actual sharks outside of the Discovery Channel. So
it's not something that you could ever envision happening to you or being in that situation. I totally get that. I totally get that. It's different upbringings in different parts of the world. It's a great scene. I would rank Robert Shaw's death in Jaws as maybe one of the most effective on-screen deaths in any movie I've ever seen, horror movies especially. It's a credit to Steven Spielberg for knowing how to pull that off, and to Robert Shaw for being able to sell it as hard as he does. And he died only 4 years after this movie. Sad. I know. He's so fucking good. He's such a good actor.
Yeah, he is very good in this movie.
Everybody's so good in this movie. I know that I said that already, but like I can't reiterate enough how incredible all of the performances in this movie are.
Yeah. Well, after Robert Shaw dies, we get an incredible scene where they end up defeating the shark.
Oh, in one of the most fantastic ways ever, which everybody knows. With the boat going down and Roy Scheider going into the water and the shark's coming at him and it's got the scuba tank lodged in its mouth. And he ad-libbed another iconic line, "Smile, you son of a..." Boom. The shark blowing up is so fucking satisfying. Like, every time I see it, it almost always gets some sort of vocal reaction from me. Almost always.
It is very, very satisfying to see, especially after how, visceral Robert Shaw's death is.
Yeah.
Only moments before.
It feels like justice.
Very cathartic.
It does. It feels so satisfying to just watch this massive shark just explode. I love it. I never get tired of it, no matter how many times I've seen it. And that's a hallmark of good filmmaking, when moments like that stick with you. Like, there's a reason why Jaws is not only one of the most quotable films of all time, but just one of the most iconic when it comes to scenes. It's a movie that even if you haven't seen it, you probably know it from beginning to end, just from how entrenched it's become in pop culture.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, after Jaws, there were a lot of imitators because it was such a big success. And even, imitation shark movies. But I think the reason why there hasn't been another great shark movie is because Jaws is such a classic.
Right.
Because it's such a classic that everything in the genre, essentially, of shark attack movies just feels like an imposter when held up.
Because Jaws does it so right. How are you gonna do better? Well, how are you even gonna bring something original to it?
Well, and that's the thing. I feel like the only other shark attack movies that are successful are the ones that are self-aware and not self-serious.
Right.
Because Jaws is very serious, it doesn't take itself too jokingly.
It's got humor in the right places. It has plenty of comic relief, which is something that Spielberg does very well. So at times it does feel very lighthearted, but at its core, it is a very serious film. It's not intended to be jokey or over the top, like it sets itself up very seriously, and it takes itself very seriously, and it does what it does so well that it works.
Yeah, and that's why, I feel like the only other successful shark attack movies are ones that go in the opposite direction with that. Your Deep Blue Seas, where, like, it is very over the top and campy and silly, because it is something different than Jaws.
Right. Yeah, I feel like the like you said, the only successful shark movies post Jaws are ones that are campy to an extent. I don't want to get into that quite yet. I want to talk just briefly about the aftermath of this movie, sort of the cultural impact it had on America.
Thousands of murdered sharks.
Yeah, like after this movie came out, there was such a massive spike in people like going out to kill sharks, because at that time there was no Shark Week, dedicated to educating people about what sharks really are. For a lot of people, this was the only exposure to sharks they had. This and the novel that it's based on, written by Peter Benchley, who did co-write this movie. And Peter Benchley himself felt so guilty after the fact that so many sharks were killed and that sharks were sort of being demonized, that he basically devoted the rest of his life to spreading like legitimate shark education and making people aware that sharks are not just out to kill you and eat you. Like, it's a movie, and it was a book. It's fictional. It's supposed to be horror. I guess the book was more pulp horror than anything else. But yeah, man, I mean, people were scared to go in the water, like, legitimately, not even just in the ocean, but like lakes and streams and rivers and stuff, because they couldn't set foot in the water without associating it with this movie, with, a killer great white shark that was gonna come along and eat them. People were scared to take a bath. And yeah, it's certainly regrettable that people started killing sharks and demonizing them after this, but like, fuck, to have that kind of lasting impact on the culture of, not just this country, but the world, that's a strong film. That's a very strong film.
It's almost as bad as after the movie version of Cujo came out, when people started killing dogs everywhere.
Hey man, after Cujo, people didn't want to own Saint Bernards.
I mean, that's true.
It's a thing. It's pretty easy to influence people with your art, and something you gotta be careful of. Make sure your message is on point.
And they had to wait until Beethoven to come out.
Yeah, between
to rehabilitate their image.
Between Cujo and Beethoven, nobody wanted Saint Bernards. Oh man. Should we talk a little bit about the shark prop itself? We sort of mentioned it a little bit. I've heard some people say that they don't think the shark effects hold up well in this movie.
I think they really hold up well.
Yeah, I'm really, really inclined to disagree that they don't hold up.
I think the reason they hold up so well is because how restrained they are in using them. And I know a lot of
Yeah.
that is out of necessity because, the shark prop was notoriously shitty.
Yeah, it kept breaking down. When they built it at first, they tested it in a tank and it worked fine, but they weren't testing it in salt water. So when they put it in the ocean, it just sank immediately. And they had to get a team of divers to go down and dredge this big fake shark up from the bottom of the ocean because they just dropped it. Which I think is hilarious. I also love the story about George Lucas getting his head stuck in the shark's mouth when he went to visit Spielberg and Spielberg showed him the prop. And George Lucas stuck his head in the mouth, and Steven Spielberg thought it would be funny to have it close its mouth, but then it broke immediately. And George Lucas had his head stuck in the mouth of this big, dumb, fake shark for 3 hours. And also, just considering who George Lucas is, like, I find that mental image absolutely hilarious of George Lucas with his head stuck in an animatronic shark's mouth for 3 fucking hours.
Come on, guys. This isn't funny anymore. This isn't funny anymore, guys.
I also think part of the reason that the effects hold up so well in this movie is sort of falls under the blanket of why practical effects work so well, especially in horror movies, is having there be something physical for the actors to react to, as opposed to CG, where it's like, how are you supposed to show that you're really afraid of something when you're interacting with, like, mocap balls on sticks or something like that, or like a cardboard cutout? And something about, like, the tangibility of the shark makes it seem more real, I think. Like, yeah, some of the shark's movements seem very stiff because it was just a big robot shark, but it's there, like when Robert Shaw is being killed, like, he is in its mouth.
Yeah,
it's on the boat.
The feeling of tangibility is really important, like you were saying, and I think having a physical version there really gives the actors a sense of scale to work with.
I agree. I would say that even in, like, later Jaws sequels that are much cornier, something like Jaws 3D.
Jaws the Revenge.
Well, that's a totally different thing. But, like, I even have a soft spot for Jaws 3D. It's super corny. It's super schlocky. But, like, the shark is still a physical prop, and I think that still makes it scarier than any CG shark you could ever make. Because, it's you can tell when it's CG. Even in more modern movies where the CG is better, it's still not a real thing that's there, Like I said, that's my general argument for practical over CG in most situations, especially in horror. Yeah, do you want to rate this?
Sure. Yeah, let's just jump into ratings.
And then we can talk about some shark culture.
Yeah.
You can start.
Well, I think this movie is the perfect shark attack movie. There's a reason there hasn't been any that quite meet its level. It's definitely one of my favorite Spielberg movies. It is very historically notable for the event blockbuster tentpole movie. I do think it drags just slightly in the second act, but that's the only minor complaint I have with it. Besides that, it's perfectly acted, perfectly shot. The sound design is phenomenal. The score is iconic, and it's endlessly quotable. I'm gonna give this a 4.5 out of 5. Definitely, if you haven't seen it, stop listening to this right now and just watch it.
If you haven't seen Jaws, what the fuck are you doing? This movie came out almost 50 years ago. Like, Jesus Christ.
You're at the end of this episode. You should have done this earlier.
If you haven't seen Jaws, fucking see Jaws. Jesus fucking Christ. Yeah, I can virtually agree with everything you just said, minus the slight drag in the second act. This is one of my favorite movies, my favorite Spielberg, one of my favorite horror movies of all time. It is the gold standard for shark movies, and I legitimately think that it will probably never be topped. Maybe I'll eat my words someday down the line, but I think that I would be lying if I gave this movie anything other than a perfect 5 out of 5. It is the perfect shark film. It's a perfect, flawless masterpiece of a movie. And yeah, I love Jaws. That'll give Jaws an average rating of 4.8 out of 5 pods. Nearly perfect. If you haven't seen Jaws, fucking see Jaws. I cannot imagine that anybody has not seen Jaws at this point. So to move on, we did not have an opportunity to watch any other shark films to review in this episode, but to sort of flesh out a little bit, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time talking about shark films in general and where the legacy of Jaws has taken shark films and the different direction it's taken shark films. And honestly, I think the whole idea of Shark Week owes a lot to Jaws.
Definitely, yeah.
I think not only did this film spawn a lot of imitators, like you mentioned before, with stuff like Piranha and Alligator, but it really kind of invigorated people's fascination with sharks. And there have been a lot of shark movies over the years. Some entertaining and some not.
Honestly, my favorite shark attack movies, outside of Jaws, obviously, are ones, like I said before, that really don't take themselves seriously.
I 100% agree.
And I think that is the most common way people approach shark movies. I mean, you always get, your 47 meters down and such, but most of the time they don't take themselves seriously. You see like that in Deep Blue Sea. You see that in Shark Attack 3 Megalodon. You see that in Sharknado.
I honestly, like I said before, I have a soft spot for Jaws 3D. It's not a good movie, but the premise of a giant killer shark being trapped in SeaWorld is outrageously funny to me. And they do so much fun stuff with that like I can't hate on that movie. And it has some of the worst, dumbest 3D effects I've ever seen in any movie.
Is it in that one or Jaws the Revenge, or both, where the shark roars?
That's in Jaws the Revenge,
okay.
Which is such a fucking god-awful movie. Like, Jaws 2 took itself pretty seriously, and I like Jaws 2, but it's nowhere near as iconic as the first one. They did get Roy Scheider to return, which I think is pretty impressive. That they actually got him to sign on for another Jaws movie.
It's all about that money,
It's all about that money. And it's got some really good moments, but nothing as masterful as the first Jaws, and without the Spielberg touch, but then, yeah, Jaws the Revenge is such a boring, hot mess that goes so far outside the realm of possibility. Just the idea of a shark having a psychic connection with Ellen Brody and hunting her and her family all the way from New York to the Bahamas is so fucking stupid.
It's pretty funny, though.
I mean, it's funny. Jaws 4's biggest sin is that it's boring as balls until like the last 15 minutes.
Yeah, the concept is very funny, but it doesn't stay fun throughout the funny concept.
No, it doesn't. I do love Deep Blue Sea a lot. But like you said, that's a very schlocky shark movie. It's enjoyable, not because it's a good movie, because it's not, but it's one of those like so bad it's good movies. I vaguely remember seeing Shark Night 3D, which came out in the late 2000s 3D gimmick craze, not long after Piranha 3D and stuff like that. I remember that being a somewhat entertaining but very stupid movie. Sharknado fucking speaks for itself.
Yeah, I mean,
I feel like we're gonna have to do an episode on Sharknado at some point.
Yeah, I can't bring myself to watch any of the sequels, though, honestly.
There's too many.
It's just beating a dead horse after the first one.
I did see the second one, and I haven't seen any of the others. And I think there's 6 now. I think there's 6 Sharknadoes. And maybe I'll bring myself to watch them at some point. But my problem with the Sharknado franchise is they've gotten too self-aware. It was always like a very self-aware, stupid, dumb movie with bad effects. But Sharknado 2 was so nudge, nudge, wink, wink that it was obnoxious.
Yeah, like the first one's a funny standalone bit, but after that
it's like they realize that they hit gold with their bad idea, and yeah, they're beating a dead horse. I absolutely agree. We watched 47 Meters Down a few weeks ago, and it was so boring that we didn't consider it even worthy of an episode. Did you ever see The Shallows? The one that came out a couple years ago with Blake Lively? I thought that was a halfway competent, serious shark movie. It had a lot of problems that ultimately I don't think make it a very good film, but it had some elements that I really liked, and the last 15 minutes was 100% unadulterated schlock. I would halfway recommend that movie, I would say. If you like Jaws, it does not bring anything new to the franchise, or to the genre, I should say. It's decent, and Blake Lively ain't bad to look at. That's all I'll say.
Weren't the open water movies shark movies?
Oh, yeah. I don't think I ever saw those.
Me either. I remember, like, them being very hyped when they came out.
Open Water was based on a true story, wasn't it? I think it was a reenactment of something that happened.
Unquote, based on a true story.
I mean, hyper exaggerated for films, but that's the one where there's like a couple out on like a sailboat or whatever that ends up being capsized or something like that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
And it's all like shot like where kind of Jaws style where it's like in the water.
Okay, I might have seen the first one years ago. I don't remember.
I've never seen it. I just remember reading about it.
Like we were saying before, like Jaws sets such a gold standard. Like it's virtually impossible to do anything original without being inherently ridiculous, which I think is fine. Like, if you're gonna make a fun, schlocky shark movie and you can do it well, like, more power to you. Like, that's why I like movies like Deep Blue Sea. But I don't know how you'd even begin to make a serious shark movie that wouldn't just be a blatant ripoff of Jaws.
Yeah, honestly, because it really sets the standard. Speaking of new shark movies, though,
oh yeah,
we watched the trailer for this new one coming out very soon.
In like 3 or 4 weeks, I believe.
Yeah, it's called The Meg. stars Jason Statham. It seems to be a joint production of Chinese film companies and U.S. film companies.
Yeah, I think so. The trailer doesn't give away too much, but it sets up this like scientific team exploring like a super deep sea trench and discovering all of these like new species, but there's also a megalodon.
Yeah,
Which,
they have this like underwater, like BioShock future society almost.
yeah, I think that's supposed to be the
Base.
research station. It in that sense, it very much gave me like a Deep Blue Sea kind of vibe. But what I did appreciate about this trailer and why I'm kind of excited for this movie is I don't think that the filmmakers are under any illusions of how ridiculous this movie is going to
It
be.
seems schlocky enough. The one thing I'm worried about is in the trailer we watched, it showed a lot of action without really showing much of any set pieces.
Yeah,
It seemed a lot of disembodied action, and I'm worried that like it's gonna be boring.
I could see that. I hope it's not boring. I think it sets up some cool stuff, like the research base and the shots we get of like one of the characters in a submarine being attacked by a giant squid, and then the shark comes along and eats the squid. What I'm hoping for this movie is Crank meets Jaws. If it can do something along those lines, I think I'll be happy. Without
that's a
being
high
boring.
bar.
It's a very high bar, and I'm keeping my expectations low. But if it delivers on the fun action schlock, which is something that I think Jason Statham is very good at, and putting him in a shark movie seems like either gold or a recipe for disaster. I don't know. But I definitely want to see this movie.
I mean, it does look like it's directed by John Turteltaub, which is the guy who directed the National Treasure movies.
Oh, fantastic.
Which is actually quite a good sign.
That's a very good sign, actually. Now, if only Jason Statham was replaced with Nicolas Cage,
Yes,
and you'd have the
yes.
recipe for a perfect movie. Rainn Wilson is in it. He seems to be one of the comic relief characters, as Rainn Wilson does. I don't know. I think it looks fun. I'm going to go into it with low expectations, so I won't be disappointed. And if it makes me laugh and I have a good time, then honestly, that's all I want from it. I'm not expecting a serious film.
I will say one thing that might worry you slightly. It worries me.
Oh, no.
Is originally Eli Roth was originally going to direct this movie. And he left the movie due to creative differences. Mainly, he wanted it to be an R-rated
Oh, no.
movie, and the studio didn't want that to happen.
Rough. That's rough. No, that's not great. I think Eli Roth could do a very entertaining shark movie.
I think so too. He actually he wrote the original version of the Meg as well. So a written and directed Eli Roth
my God.
shark movie. We almost got.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Hopefully there's still pieces of his script intact in this, and that they didn't just completely scrap it and start from scratch.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
honestly.
I don't know either.
He apparently also wanted to play the lead role on top of writing and directing.
That would have been
which
amazing
was probably
as well.
the final straw for the studio.
Probably.
Because it had like a $150 million budget.
Well, I mean, also Eli Roth can't make a movie without copious amounts of blood and gore, which is good for a shark movie. But if they're trying to go for a wider audience, I can see why they wouldn't have wanted to go with that. That's pretty fucking disappointing, I must say. The fact that we got that close to a written and directed Eli Roth film starring Eli Roth about a giant killer shark, that sounds like the movie that I want to see.
Yeah. So my expectations are now a little lower, but I'm still excited, especially because it's National Treasure guy.
Fuck yeah. I'm definitely going to go see that movie in theaters.
Yeah.
I mean, Movie Pass, who cares? I'm not paying for it. Yeah.
Sign up for Movie Pass.
Yeah.
This isn't an ad, but maybe pay us.
Yeah, hey, Movie Pass, we love what you do. Give us money.
Or just free Movie Pass. That would be cool, too.
Or even just that. Like, that would be totally worth it. But yeah, if you don't have Movie Pass, do it. If you like to go see movies, do it. Okay, yeah, I think that'll about bring us to the end of our Shark Week extravaganza. If you like the show, be sure to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want to give us your thoughts on Jaws or on the trailer of The Meg, or to tell us what your favorite shark movie is, hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, @PodPeoplePod. You can send us an email, podpeoplepod@gmail.com. Follow us on Letterboxd for a list of all the movies we've talked about on the show and their average ratings with links to those episodes. And yeah, what are you doing with your Shark Week? You watching all those good shark shows? I wish I was.
Try not to get eaten.
Try not to get eaten. But yeah, you can follow me on Twitter @Mr. Van Awesome for a collection of memes, wrestling-related tweets, and the occasional drunk tweet. You never know what you're going to get.
Well, I'm Mr. Sheets on Twitter if you want, those dank memes or socialist rants, I guess. I don't know.
Well, yeah, thanks for listening, as always. What are we doing next week?
New Unfriended.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot.
The dark web.
The most evil film that Blumhouse has ever created.
The intellectual dark web.
The intellectual dark web. If Jordan Peterson is not in this movie, I don't want to see it.
I was looking at the credits on Letterboxd for the new Unfriended, and it did have Jake Paul as one of the people in it.
Oh, no.
It was at the very bottom, so it must be like a very minor cameo.
Or maybe somebody's watching one of his videos and then they exit out of it because it's terrible.
Maybe he gets killed.
Oh, maybe he does get killed. That would be great. Next week, you can expect a review of Unfriended the Dark Web. I don't know what to expect for this movie, but check back with us next week to hear our thoughts on that and go see it maybe. Thank you for listening. I'm Matisse Van Rossum.
And I'm Ben Sheets.
And until next time, stay out of the water. And don't forget to rip those fat clouds like Shark Boy.